welcome to Feeling Therapeutic, a show about complicated feelings. Each week, I bring in a therapist to discuss a complex feeling of their choice, one that clients typically struggle to apply to their own lives. My name is Dr. Jonathan Rahm, and with me this week is Dr. Natasha Conde Jahnel. She is a professor of social service work at Cambridge College in Sudbury, Ontario, who does research on body dysmorphic disorder. New to private practice, Dr. Conde Jahnel applies her lived experience with BDD alongside her 15 years of experience in the field, working primarily with at-risk or street entrenched youth. Her PhD focus is on the intersection between madness and genius. Tasha, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course. It's a really neat opportunity to be here, especially because it's my first podcast and I'm talking about what I love. So, yeah.
Well, before we talk about what you love, I think that one of the ways we introduce people is to just ask, "How are you feeling?"
How am I feeling? Um, well, like I was mentioning earlier, it's the time of year when things all just kind of culminate. So
Yeah,
I am feeling some stress, although I do tell my students that stress itself is not a feeling. So I suppose in this very moment, I'm feeling some excitement and a little bit of feelings of anxiety about completing all the work that I need to do.
do you tend to differentiate those two, or do you find that they flow into one another?
Excitement and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know that they're very closely linked. Um, and I think they happen on a spectrum for me. I differentiate when it becomes anxiety, with the feeling of discomfort. Yeah.
For sure. I feel like there's a an aspect of the discomfort where you have to care about a thing in order to feel discomfort about it. I
Mhm.
remember some advice I got back when I used to do like community theater. They said if you stop getting stage fright, just quit because it means that you just don't really care about what's about to
Interesting.
happen.
Okay. Yeah. I like that. That's that's good advice. Yeah.
Yeah, it surprised me because it was so true. I think came a time where I didn't feel any sort of um I guess a eustress or positive anxiety about the thing. I was just indifferent,
Mm.
and then that's why I stopped. And I find that seems to be true about all the work that we do, is that if you stop feeling a little bit of like, oh man, this is a big deal, then to you
Mhm.
it's no longer a big deal. That's just the truth of it.
That's right. Yeah.
So what emotion are we talking about today?
So today we're going to be talking about the feeling of disgust, which
Hmm.
I suppose is not really necessarily like it's not a primary feeling. Um, and when we're feeling it about other things external to us, um, it may not kind of be felt in the same way that it would when we're feeling disgust about our own selves.
Hmm.
So, yeah, again, like any other emotion, there's a huge range as to how it can be felt.
For the listeners who their understanding of emotions is born from Pixar's Inside Out, disgust does show up as alongside anger and fear. And so I'm interested when you say it's not a primary emotion. What do you mean by that, or how do you get there? How do you know?
Um, how do you get to disgust?
Or how do you get to that not being a primary, it
Oh, I
coming from
see.
something or being built on something?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. I just meant like primary in the sense that we have those like very common um mad, sad, glad,
Hmm.
fear. There's those five like very primary emotions where other ones sort of stem off from them, I suppose, or are kind of in different categories.
Hmm.
Um so I just meant it like that. But then when we're talking about the distinction between um feeling it about external objects or things versus feeling it about oneself. Um, I suppose if we're feeling disgust with like an image on the television or
Hmm.
a story that we read, um, we might be able to hold it at a certain distance and recognize that um, it's it's being caused by the thing external to us. But
Right.
then when we feel disgust about ourselves, our own body, our own
Hmm.
being, um, to me, it just becomes a lot more complex, and it's a very um, it's its whole other kind of brand of awful in the sense that it's hard to distinguish where it's coming from, and how to live comfortably with that feeling.
So, if I understand you correctly, is that this externalized disgust or disgust that's like born from something that's outside of you has very different consequences to
Yeah,
one that's internalized and about
yeah,
yourself?
yes. I like that word that around consequences.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, like you mentioned, I've been studying body dysmorphic disorder for a long time, and
Hmm.
I'm kind of in right in the middle of it right now as we just put on our first international body dysmorphic disorder online conference. Um, and it's as you know, it's a very misunderstood and not widely um, heard of um, disorder. So I was really surprised. We had about 500 participants, which was great.
Hmm.
400 clinicians, and then those with lived experience. But so when I'm talking about disgust, that's what I relate it to, is the feelings that's when somebody is living with body dysmorphic disorder, the feelings that they have about their own appearance, which I think everybody in their life, I think, probably feels on a certain at a certain level at some point in their life, even if it's just for a brief moment. Um, but when it's a disorder, it becomes really insidious, and you can't actually necessarily distinguish between what's reality and what's what's not reality. So in this particular disorder, there's very low insight. Um, so those feelings of disgust around one's appearance can start to feel like they're actually you. Like you
Hmm.
are disgusting. People are disgusted by you. Um, and it's very cruel. Um, it has a high rate of suicidality. And I think particularly when individuals don't um, have a lot of insight. But even then, when you do realize what's happening, when you recognize what's going on, it can be extremely difficult to live with.
That makes a lot of sense to me. It sounds like it's something that has an element of spinning out of control, that it starts as something maybe seemingly common and innocuous. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, it's affecting the decisions that you make about
Mhm.
your body, about how to act, etc.
Mhm.
So before we kind of go into how it comes up naturally in therapy, I thought I might
Sure.
inform our listeners that the Cambridge Dictionary defines disgust as a very strong feeling of dislike or disapproval. And the online etymology dictionary says that it was adopted into English in the 1600s, and it's literally meant to be an aversion to the taste of something, and it comes from the French. I'm gonna mispronounce this for sure. Degust, literally meaning distaste, and that comes from the Latin gustare, which means to taste. So it's coming from this very literal definition of something just tasting bad to you. And I think the way that it's sort of folded into our language today is that there is an involuntary reaction to just something affecting your senses. And I was wondering
Mhm.
if that plays into your understanding of disgust at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the like the inclusion of involuntary, I think, is really important there because it's not a pleasant feeling to live with, and I don't think
Hmm.
most people don't intentionally move toward that kind of a feeling where many people will create situations in their life where they will move towards happiness or excitement or overjoy or, even um, like extreme elation. We'll seek those things out, but people tend not to seek out the feelings of disgust unless you're on like that show, The X Factor, which I just remembered from however many years ago, where they ate spiders and all that stuff. Um,
Then you got a hit Vegas show on your hands.
yes, exactly. So, um, yeah, it's a difficult one to sit with. And when I talk to individuals who are living with it, the added layer is that when you're feeling disgust about, again, an object external to you, you have some control over the feeling a little bit. Like if you remove yourself from it, then okay, you can get some distance from the emotion. If you're living with the source of your disgust, if you're actually within that, you're inside your body on a daily basis, and you can never get away from yourself, and that's what's causing you feelings um of disgust, then it's accompanied by high degrees of shame,
Mm-hmm.
because you are the thing that is disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, again, it really is all um it all takes place within one's mind. The the distortion that they're having, the distorted vision of what they're actually seeing in the mirror.
Right.
um and that's how it occurs, is it's basically a distorted view of yourself in the
Right.
mirror. And I've asked myself before, like, what did this exist before mirrors ever existed? And I don't know if it's possible to do research in that area, but um I wonder. And then that also brings up the question, okay, well, social media, which is like a constant reflection of um other people and images of perfection, how much of a role does that play in it? Well, that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know that before the advent of like mass social media, body dysmorphic disorder did exist. Um, and for individuals who may not know, or who are kind of wondering exactly what that looks like for somebody living with body dysmorphic disorder, it's most commonly people who have body dysmorphic disorder have um, are focusing on something from like the neck up. That's most common, which is why I think, again, it's so understood, because it's called body dysmorphic, sort of misunderstood body dysmorphic disorder, even though it
Right.
can technically be any part of your body. Most common, it's the neck up. So a nose is a very common feature for people to focus on, or even the skin. So your appearance of your skin. Some people may see their skin as um, being like flawed, marked, pockmarked, or severe acne, or just disfigured in some
Sure.
way that's not actually there in reality. And then there's body dysmorphic disorder that happens where the concentration is on hair, actually, and like an extreme fear of losing one's hair, or hair thinning, or hairline receding. um, then there's everything that accompanies aging. um, but it can show up in other places too. I've heard of the eyes, the stomach. There's also muscle dysmorphia, so people um, who feel that their body looks disgusting without muscle. And then sometimes we actually see those individuals become bodybuilders,
Mm-hmm.
and become obsessed with amassing muscle, and it just can never be enough.
So
So,
if I understand you correctly, this kind of the problem with this internalized or this disgust that's turn inward is that it's this involuntary reaction that when it goes to a point of obsession or compulsion to do something about it, because it's coming from a place of not necessarily being particularly or fully rational, fully something that's based on evidence. It's just based on an emotion, a reaction.
Yeah.
You end up trying to solve the quote unquote problem, but you can't solve the problem by just getting rid of the offending feature, because it's
Hmm.
not just because of that feature, it's because of how your brain interprets
Yeah.
that information.
Yes. That is exactly it. That's a very, very good understanding. Um, and there's been some research, particularly by Dr. Jamie Fusner, who works out of the University of Toronto,
Hmm.
um, on exactly what's happening in the visual processing of an individual who has BDD.
Hmm.
And they're at the very beginning of their research, but um, there are some suspicions that it could potentially be related to a visual processing disorder.
Hmm.
So that's, to me, that's really interesting as well. And it just demonstrates how much of the issue doesn't lie within the way that the person really looks. It's the way that they're perceiving themselves. And people will go to all kinds of lengths to remedy what they think is the problem. Um, and I think the statistics right now are that at least 10% of people seeking cosmetic surgery treatments have body dysmorphic disorder.
Hmm.
Um, and there's currently no like standardized or um, there's no obligation on the part of the surgeon to do a screening for it.
Sure.
If they suspect, then they will. But I would say the majority of them don't do it as a standard practice, which again, kind of questions like, what's happening there? Is this right? Is this a moral thing to be doing? But anyway, that's a whole other part of my research, and I won't go into that.
There's definitely a can of worms there too, because
Yeah,
if it is body dysmorphic disorder and the surgeon, let's say, does a top rate job, 10 out of 10, best surgeon, it still wouldn't matter. It
that's right.
wouldn't make an
That's right.
effect. And I would, for both for the ethical and moral reasons to do that check, I would also encourage any surgeon to say, hey, this is a big part of what you do is patient satisfaction. If you're a plastic surgeon, if there's
Hmm.
no hope, there's no
Hmm.
chance that it would affect their view on this thing, then
Hmm.
it's on you, even for selfish reasons, to go out of your way to make sure that this isn't what's happening here.
Yeah. Um, and there have been so many cases of individuals, it not being recognized until after the surgery happens that somebody's living with body dysmorphic disorder. Because then the they'll go back and say like, you didn't do this correctly, when maybe um there's no fault there. But even if it's done correctly, then what can happen is the obsession can morph to a different part of that person's body or face.
Hmm.
So it's never ending, and it's really never resolved by changing one's um external view of who they are, or not who they are, but just like changing your appearance. Sorry, your appearance. Um, and I was going to say one more thing, but I don't remember. Oh yeah, there was a case in the
Hmm.
States. Um, I can't remember exactly how long ago. I'm going to say 15, 20 years. Of someone opening fire in a cosmetic surgery clinic who had had
Hmm.
multiple surgeries and was dissatisfied and could not, for the life of them, recognize where that was coming from, but really did and truly believe that it was the surgeon who had kind of botched them. Um, Only to be discovered later that this individual had BDD. So, and there's lots of studies too around anger and BDD, and how those two things can be closely related just because of the torturous nature of it.
Right. So a client comes in feeling this kind of pointed, this reflective disgust, this disgust that's born out of looking in the mirror or thinking about themselves. What options are available to them? What's the approach? How do you address those feelings in a way that's healthy.
Yeah. So, um, the kind of the gold standard treatment right now is exposure and response prevention therapy.
Okay.
Yeah. So very, very carefully, um, sort of pointing out the faulty cognition,
Hmm.
um, and then actually exposing the individual to feared situations. So something very small could be if an individual typically has the lights lowered, or wants the light lowered in rooms that they are in therapy, you might ask if you can turn the light on or even have like a brighter light next to them. The things that so it's about exposing the individual, but also trying um, to stop the compulsions. So
Hmm.
having a lower lighting and needing that everywhere you go would be a compulsion. Someone may always have their hair in front of their face. That would be a compulsion. You might ask them in therapy if they're comfortable putting their hair in a ponytail, if it's a female.
Sure.
So, and it's different depending on what the individual's living with, but
Hmm.
it seems cruel and unusual to expose them to their worst fears. But as with all exposure therapies, what happens. The person is living through it. Their subjective units of distress go way up. And then they recognize that this thing that they perceive as having the worst possible outcome and it is absolutely terrifying, they're still safe afterwards. They're still
Right.
okay. Um, and doing that over and over and over and over and over and over and over again
Hmm.
trains the brain to recognize, okay, hey. And there's also this idea of like, maybe not,
Right.
maybe I am disgusting to other people, maybe not.
Right.
um
Being okay with the uncertainty of it.
yeah, but then saying to yourself, what are my values?
Mm.
Like, is it important for me to be able to go out into the world and actively participate in things socially? And we often find that um, an individual will value other things in their life more truly than they will their appearance,
Sure.
when they kind of check in with themselves. And then we can shift the focus of what they want to do with their life from what they really and truly genuinely value, and move it away from appearance. So it's tough. And there are people who have been housebound for years
Right.
living with this disorder. So um, that kind of exposure would be extremely gradual, and then we have to be really cautious about it.
I appreciate that it's taking hold of a biopsychosocial model of
Hmm.
understanding of these kind of conditions where you're not just saying like, okay, let us in this isolated space come up with ways to make you feel better about this thing that's troubling you. It's addressing that there are neural pathways that you have in your brain that have developed that are reinforcing this, and it deserves the work to replace and to give you something else to work with when you're trying to go a different direction. And also the social aspect. I think a big argument that someone with BDD might make is that society has put an emphasis for them in their eyes on beauty, a beauty standard that they're trying to meet. If they've never heard of silky smooth hair in a
Hmm.
commercial, they wouldn't
Hmm.
be comparing themselves to that. They wouldn't
Yeah.
have that internal monologue.
Yeah.
So I like that the therapy is holistic. It sounds like it really addresses all aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just as I was listening to you speak, I was realizing, which is something I forget sometimes, that although BDD is very debilitating, or it can be, and it's I think it's 5% of the world's population living with it. I think not anyone, I shouldn't say anyone, but many people can relate
Right.
to the the feeling of placing pressure on themselves or emphasizing appearance um, over other things,
Sure.
um, and needing to look a certain way. So it's not necessarily an unfamiliar um, way of being. I think it's just the gravity of it when you're living with BDD, but um, on different spectrums too. You know, those kinds of practices can be helpful for people, even if you just. I think it might even be useful with people. I think anyway in therapy that's done with individuals with eating disorders. I think there's also trying to shift those values again.
Right.
Um,
Well, that actually leads me to wondering what logical leaps are people with BDD making that are worth pointing out that it might not be as true as they think it is.
hmm, yeah, that's a good question. So an example might be, and this might not be answering the question you're thinking about, but it's just because exposure response prevention's on my mind. But maybe you go for a walk with your therapist on a busy street, and the feeling before you go on the walk is everybody's going to be looking at me, and I don't want to expose people to me because I don't want them to feel disgusted. I don't want
Right.
them to look away, and um, I just don't want to be stared at. And so you'll go on that walk with the therapist, and the therapist would ask you and help you to look at the bigger picture. So often, like looking at a room around you, or when you're looking at the mirror, not looking at yourself, but looking at the reflection of the room from the mirror. So again, it goes back to visual processing, right? Looking at the bigger picture, like, okay, so where's the proof that people are looking at you? And that can
Evidence
be a
collection.
metaphor for life too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When we become sometimes like overly consumed with ourselves. Someone might say, just get some perspective. And when we open up our eyes and think about really ourselves within our place in the world, um, it can be a very different sense of who we are and what we're grateful for. And um, yeah.
Well, I would say on that uplifting note, uh, I want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and having a open conversation about something that's so complicated and a very heavy topic for a lot of people to deal with disgust, especially disgust pointed at themselves.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you giving me the space to do that. I think this is a wonderful podcast that is just another step towards people being okay with openly discussing the things that normally happen between behind closed doors with a one-on-one in a therapy session. So I'm all for removing any kind of stigmas around talking about feelings and emotions and disorders and how the brain works. So I love that this is happening and that you're doing this.
Well, since you set me up for an amazing segue, I'm going to take it. Feels like
Okay.
the right time to remind our listeners that the show is brought to them by Rolls and Associates. Rolls and Associates is in-person and virtual therapy, and we provide it in various locations across Ontario. Our team specializes in treating mental health disorders, addictions, relationship issues among all age groups across the lifespan for individuals, couples, families, and children. So if you or someone you care about would benefit from psychotherapy, please visit rollspsychotherapy.com. That's my plug. Tasha, is there anything that you want to direct our listeners to?
Oh goodness. Yeah. When I looked this over in the show notes, I was like, "Oh, what kind of podcast can I direct them to?" But
Do
honestly,
it.
what I might just say is, I would just plug in general. Um, if you're the kind of person maybe who shies away from talking about your feelings openly, give yourself a little challenge. Maybe do your own exposure this week. see what happens, what the worst case scenario is when you try talking about your feelings to somebody maybe who is not in your close circle, or opening up a conversation that might normally be a little bit outside of your comfort zone.
I'm very excited to go do that as soon as we're done recording. So,
Awesome.
with another episode done, I'm just going to say that feels pretty good. Thanks for listening.